Well, hello everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to our virtual AUD auditorium, which, for better words, you must be by now used to. The way today's talk will proceed is just like every other talk we've had in the past few weeks. So essentially, you're welcome to share your questions. You can start sending your questions, I think, as we move along the talk. But so as the talk ends, I'll gather those questions and read them for you. Okay, so first come, first serve. So keep that in mind. So I'm unlucky not to have personally met today's speaker before, because I quite like his work. But then I'm lucky enough to be able to introduce him just now. So David Gissen, today's speaker, is a historian of many things. And I say this with enormous appreciation and kind of admiration for the breadth of his research and the range of his interests. David is, of course, a historian of architecture, but also, one could say, a historian of technology and of the environment, clearly, and of the place of nature in every one of these categories. In fact, nature in his work is never alone, much less treated as an essence or a point of origin, as some of you may know already. But rather, it always appears enmeshed in disputes involving money, international diplomacy, monuments, cities in decline or otherwise, and the variety of aesthetics regime mediating between these things. This understanding of nature, not as a maternal figure or a divine authority, but as one among many interrelated actors, is important, I think, especially in times afflicted by all sorts of naturalizing views of the world, from economic deregulation to blood and soil politics, to climate change denialism, to the legislation of gender relations. We know all of these ideologies are largely predicated on the seeming authority of nature. And it seems to me that David's work concerns with the artifice behind the concept. More broadly, although his work cultivates a healthy dose of skepticism, it combines necessary interdisciplinary excursions with thorough and precise architectural connoisseurship. In addition to his scholarly work, David is an incredibly prolific writer with more than 60 essays written, and you may be familiar with his 4 books already. He's also a curator, and he teaches design and research studios, the latest one on the production of darkness in daytime Vienna. He also writes on contemporary architectural culture and produces installations. Among his latest projects are the book Manhattan Atmospheres, published in 2014, Architecture, the full title is Manhattan Atmospheres, Architecture, the Interior, and Urban Crisis. And an installation that I personally find fascinating that recreates the monumental earthwork once built to demolish the Place Vendôme column during the bloody events of the Commune in 1871 in Paris. David has talked in a number of illustrious institutions, including the CCA here in California, Columbia, MIT, Yale, and more recently, the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. We do know 2 things about David today. He's in New York, and he will offer us a kind of anthological work comprising part of his work for the past years. So welcome, David, to the School of Architecture at UCLA. We receive you with a very silent applause. It's a pleasure to have you. So you can share.
Okay, Cristóbal, thank you so much for that really generous introduction. I really appreciate it. And I hope during the Q&A we have time to talk about our mutual interest in French architectural and urban history. So yeah, we'll see if that's possible. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. Are you seeing the slide, the first slide? Okay, great. So I'm just going to jump right in and give you this, as Cristóbal mentioned, this sort of anthological lecture. So one of my favorite writers on the topic of nature is the late geographer Neil Smith. And Smith not only argued that nature was produced by societies, but that the production of nature also produced strong aspects of a society's, of our sense of subjectivity and our larger sense of aesthetic experience. Smith was a Marxist geographer, and his larger point was that nature often becomes a type of fetish in industrial societies that obscured how constructed it really is. And these are things that Cristóbal already mentioned. So this image of Yosemite Park by the American photographer Ansel Adams from 1940 is something I'm sure all of you have seen, either reproductions of it or on the screens of your computers. And it illustrates Smith's point very well. Yosemite appears as a completely uninhabited wilderness from this particular view that he created. And people travel to Yosemite to experience and recreate this photograph, as you can see on the right. They do this to experience unspoiled nature. But Yosemite is anything but a wilderness. It has roadways, as you know, because many of you have probably, who are in the LA area have probably been there. It has water and electrical infrastructure that enable it to be experienced in the way that we do experience it. It has forest management to keep it looking like people's expectations of wilderness. And Yosemite has problems like any city traveled through by millions of people. It has crime, pollution, health scares. Some of the largest drug arrests in Central California happen in Yosemite. And this photo is actually by Ansel Adams' assistant, Rondell Partridge, who was really struck by the way that Ansel Adams photographed Yosemite and offered a very different perspective of what Yosemite was as a kind of aesthetic experience. And of course, Yosemite has been a constructed landscape long before it was claimed by American settlers. In the 19th century, the valley was maintained by people who had lived here for 3,000 years. And many of the tree species that we see in Yosemite today were cultivated to specific agricultural ends and were maintained through a constant cultivation and burning of the landscape. So the vision we maintain of a place like Yosemite obscures its constructed character in multiple ways and across multiple temporalities. So the production of nature is a central aspect of the history of modern urbanization. And I think it's probably easier to see in cities. The construction of Central Park in the 19th century in New York City is an example of this process that's easy to understand. And let me just mention this lecture that I'm giving you today was a sort of debutante lecture that I was asked to give at Cooper Union when I moved back to New York this year. So the examples are cultivated more from New York City than from Los Angeles or California, so I apologize in advance. So the building of this landscape of Central Park, like Yosemite, involved enormous amounts of labor and also forms of dispossession that we are still only beginning to confront through archaeological works on sites like Seneca Village in the park, one of the first kind of free cities in New York State. And again, a certain type of aesthetics dominates here in Central Park that positions moments of artifice, such as fountains and buildings, in contrast to what's imagined to be a larger natural environment that one inhabits. And in any case, the production of nature in cities, what geographers call the urban production of nature, extends to the construction of all types of things, infrastructure like water. This is a section of the Croton Aqueduct that supplies New York City with water, roads and parkways that are not just spaces of individual mobility, but spaces where water is moved through urban space and drained, where light is supplied into cities, and that are also landscapes with trees and plants. And finally, the urban production of nature, the construction of nature, extends to the air over our heads, something I've written about quite a bit. And so many of the authors who write about the urban production of nature tend to concentrate on topics like water or waste systems, infrastructure, big infrastructural systems, or park systems. And the construction of water and park systems is well archived. That's one reason people study them so much. They have designers that we can name. They have builders we can name, like Olmsted or Robert Moses. They have municipal departments in charge of recording their construction and their aesthetic transformations to the city. But I've always been drawn to writing about the design of what I would call weaker natures, or the presence of weaker natures. And these are things that are generally a bit more fleeting, and in many cases, often much more frightening. And they're definitely more difficult to research. They are forms of nature that are often poorly documented or barely documented. There are no drawings, for example, showing this incredible lake that appeared one afternoon and evening on 42nd Street in New York City due to a water main burst in the 1970s, and would have been momentarily one of the largest bodies of water in New York City, if you think of it this way. So these weak natures are often temporary, like the landscape, for example, known as the beach, also in New York City. This was briefly one of the city's largest unofficial parks. This was made from the excavated sand from the World Trade Center's foundations and construction, and just became this place that people inhabited and used to different ends. So weak natures are not just often temporary and fleeting and difficult to archive, they're often invisible, such as the interior air that is produced by the mechanical systems and physical skins of buildings. And weak natures are often undesirable and associated with forms of physical weakness itself, such as the idea of urban darkness, and that has been a focus of my research this past year. So modernizing cities produced many things, and one of the things they produced was darkened spaces. So the first project of mine that documented what I'm calling weak nature was the book Subnature, which I published 10 years ago. And this book examines a type of counter nature that appeared in architecture theory from, let's say, the 19th century to today. And this is the table of contents that, as you can see, reads like a terrible building inspection report, right? There's a dankness, smoke, dust, puddles. This emerged from a younger time, slightly more brash time. Subnature, broadly conceived, are those things, those externalities, is a good word. They're unwanted materialist outcomes that are produced within the modern city, often as a result of various urbanization processes. So they become a de facto setting for much 19th, 20th, and 21st century urban architecture, but they're not valorized in the same way as nature. They don't become models, and they're not resources in any obvious way. They're certainly settings. Though inherently undesirable, nevertheless, we can identify various projects that attempt to negotiate the subnatures of the cities or position their presence to a particular aesthetic or symbolic effect. This was sort of one of the purposes of this particular project. So as pointed out by the historian Joanna Merewood, the Reliance building in Chicago, which you're seeing here, was conceived as an environmental work that in many ways negotiated its urban context. And one of the ways that we can detect this is in this, this vitreous terracotta skin, sort of like the fixtures that you might find in your bathrooms, like a sink or a water closet, that was applied to the exterior of this building, and that was supposed to repel the soot of industrializing Chicago, the atmosphere around it. And you can see how blackened this building has become from pollution. This is from just about 10 or 12 years after it was built. And this is what it looked like by point of comparison immediately after it was constructed. So subnatures aren't just negotiated in buildings as kind of material processes of a building itself. They're also a way that historians and other theorists in architecture have made different kinds of arguments by using representations of them. So this is a photo of the Bauhaus director's house by the architecture historian Leonardo Benevolo. And this was taken in the early 1960s by Benevolo, and it was included in his book on the history of architecture. And Benevolo was really one of the first historians that emphasized the social context of architectural historical artifacts. And he used photos like this to demonstrate that otherwise famous or canonical buildings actually existed somewhere, in some place, versus the kind of the more typical images that become reproduced in books to represent them, often right after they're built. So here we see how poor drainage, weeds, and surface decay is used to provide a sense of realism, a kind of social context in architectural historiography, but through natural matter. So another one of my arguments in the book is that subnatural aesthetics offer a critical idea of nature that's useful in vanguard architectural thought. So another strand of architectural histories, particularly of European architecture in the 20th century, or in global architecture as well, is that among various historians of the avant-garde, they often note that nature just sort of disappears, particularly in late modern works. We can detect this in earlier things, but in late modernity, nature kind of disappears as an architectural representation or as something that's contended with, let's say. So I would argue a different type of nature appears, particularly in post-war neo-avant-garde architectural aesthetics, one that's less affirmative and emphasize its human-produced character, and often fraught character. So in some cases, like this image by Arato Isozaki, what I call subnature represents a type of violent landscape of debris that becomes the context for a new imaginary world. Or perhaps we see a rethinking of the ground that is less about its natural character and more about its artifice in particular urban contexts. And this extends also to contemporary environmentalist work. An architect named Philippe Ram that I've collaborated with at times and have written about numerous times, has kind of combined this kind of neo-avant-garde fascination with what I call the subnatural with a form of environmentalism. So this is his underground house in the suburbs of Paris, in which a kind of chamber in the basement becomes the context or setting for domestic life, and that also manages to keep the house cool in the summer and warm in the winter. And another final point I want to make about this book, and this particular image is a good example, is that much of the kind of subnatural aesthetics of a post-war neo-avant-garde is often quite ironic and playing off of histories and ideas about modernism. So for example, Ram, who is a Swiss French architect, very much put that building design in dialogue with Le Corbusier's work. And this is a diagram that Le Corbusier created in which he famously stated that he had banished the basement for all time through his concrete construction system. So on the left is a traditional house made out of masonry that shows a basement, and on the right is his design in which the basement has been destroyed or demolished from the history of architecture. And Ram, of course, is interested in bringing this back. So the reason I'm even bringing up this project from 10 years ago is because it sort of was sitting on the shelf and not something I was really thinking about very recently. But I was very recently, in this past year, asked to revisit the ideas within that book. And in the context, a kind of applied context, in the context of a study on urban heat gain and the future architecture of Vienna, Austria that Cristóbal mentioned in the introduction. So I was invited to be part of a research project based in Vienna, Austria, exploring ways to mitigate urban heat gain in this particular city. Now, Vienna is a city I don't think any of us really think of as being urgently in need of a study of urban heat gain. It's not a city that we think of as being on the front lines of climate change. But Vienna is a city whose climate has shifted in recent years, and actually quite radically. So one could, at one time, categorize the Viennese climate as having very cold and icy winters to warm but moderate summers, a kind of, certainly not alpine, but proto-alpine climate, but it's shifting. For example, in the 1950s, the city of Vienna may have had 5 days where temperatures reached 90 degrees Fahrenheit. But in the past few years, it has almost 30 days when temperatures reached or exceeded that mark between April and October. And like many other European cities, there's very little air conditioning, which creates particular kinds of vulnerabilities within this city. But what made Vienna more interesting and urgent, and in many ways very personal for me, is that Vienna also has a uniquely vulnerable population of a capital city in this particular part of the world. It has a very high number of disabled people for a European capital city. In fact, one recent study claims that the number of people in Vienna who claim to have a disability is at 30%. That is an extraordinary figure. I have no idea if that includes people that wear eyeglasses as having a disability. That's an extraordinary number. It also has a uniquely elderly population and a uniquely young population of very young children for a capital city. So from a heat perspective or from a climate change perspective, it has a high percentage of what we call vulnerable groups. And these are people who typically suffer the worst effects of urban heat gain because the disabled people use much more energy when they walk. People that are elderly tend to also use more energy when they move around cities or have less resistance to heat. And children often are much less aware of onset of things like sunstroke. So as a very quick aside, when I was living in Vienna, I learned that this history of disability in the city actually has very deep roots. After World War I, the city absorbed 150,000 wounded veterans. So the city has one of the highest percentages at this time of amputees for a European capital. And in fact, Adolf Loos, an architect we typically associate with luxury villas, designed a house that could be more easily built by veteran settlers, the one-wall house that you see here. This is a construction system that was meant to be built by these disabled World War I veterans and settlers in the city. So anyway, back to heat. So the urban vulnerabilities of this particular city of Vienna are also exacerbated by its own modernization. And this will be a theme that we'll see recur throughout the studies that I'll talk to you about. So for example, we can locate a series of very large-scale urban planning efforts and then extend from the mid-19th century, what you see here, to the late 20th century, to essentially open the city to increased amounts of sunshine, what in my studio at Yale we called the solarization of urban space. So on one level, this was achieved incidentally in the planning of spaces like the Ringstrasse that you see here. This is a large square that mostly had open forms of, this is a ring road that had mostly open forms of planning with very light planning of trees and large open plazas. This is a square in front of the Votivkirche, the votive church in Vienna. And this negotiation of heat in Vienna, even before climate change was an issue, for example. So Camillo Zitta, who's a very important person to the history of urban design and maybe familiar to some of you that study urban design, he actually wrote about the experience of intense sunlight in this newly planned Ringstrasse space in Vienna. And he proposed taking bits of the medieval central core of the city and bringing it out here. So for example, he proposes this kind of cloistered pergola in this large open square and to make it an easier place to inhabit through shade. So the great Viennese social projects of the 20th century, again, likely very familiar to the audience here, reconstructed enormous areas of the city under the mantra sun, light, and air. And this was a statement on transforming the material environment of the city for its working population. So this fantastic housing project, which is 1 kilometer long, the Karl Marxhof, was designed by Carl N. during the Red Vienna years. It has like 4 subway stops along it. It's so long, this one particular project, which is this fantastical reconstruction of everyday life in early 20th century Vienna. But I dare you to stand in this courtyard during an August day in Vienna as I did. It's quite intense. So the sun-filled planning strategies in Vienna extend to late modern planning projects, such as the ones that you see here. These are a series of terraced housing by Harry Gluck, who's a late modern Viennese architect. And I don't want to say that the heat problem is caused by these buildings. It's an issue of climate and carbon, of course. But I do believe that we need to rethink some of what I call the socio-natural qualities we associate with a modernized urban environment or an enlightened urban environment. So these types of spaces are not working relative to a changing climate within this particular city. So in exploring ways architecture might negotiate urban heat gain in Vienna, I worked with 2 groups of students. And this included work in an advanced studio in Vienna at the Academy of Fine Arts. You can see an image of that on the left. And with graduate students in an advanced studio at Yale School of Architecture. And methodologically, both studios began with historical research, both in and outside of Vienna, and was collected into these large murals here. And then I'll explain a bit as we move on. And by the way, I almost never talk about pedagogy or student work in lectures of mine, but this was a fascinating experience and a flattering experience for me to be invited to teach studios and with deans and studio coordinators who specifically wanted to understand in what ways history could be brought into the studio, of which we can debate whether that's maybe at the end of this talk. So the Yale studio was much more focused in a way and a bit more unusual in its approach. So we explored the heat problem in Vienna as a contemporary environmental problem, but we also examined this as an architectural historical problem, and that's important. And we saw this as a historical problem rooted in the de facto notion that the more the city produces sunlit space, the more enlightened, natural, modernized, and better the resulting urban environment. As a response to this idea, the Yale studio explored how the modern city might gain, or in some cases regain from a historical position, daytime darkness as an environmental strategy more generally. And then in a design assignment, we explored how to rebuild daytime darkness into Vienna's architecture more specifically. So I'll spend the rest of this lecture explaining some of the next 20 minutes or so or 15 minutes of the historical and design research that I conducted with the Yale students. And this will bring us back to some of the ideas I already mentioned on the urban production of nature, weak nature, and subnature, sort of put things together for you a bit. So the elimination of daytime darkness is absolutely not a given evolution of urban architecture, but something that emerges from a series of changing ideas about physical darkness and light in buildings. So generally speaking, darkness becomes a suspect quality in European and American cities in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and in the colonial building projects undertaken by colonies, by metropoles in the 20th century. The transformation of darkness into something abject, or we might say othered, can be traced to specific architectural theories of modernity and in ways that mirror other material qualities that I examined in subnature and I discussed earlier. So as a spatial quality, darkness becomes othered in specific architectural texts and episodes. For example, one of the most important French architectural theorists and educators of the early 19th century, Quatremère de Cassis, argued that architecture emerged in three key forms: the primitive wooden hut, the textile tent, and the cave. And de Cassis claimed that the dark cave was the origin point of the architecture of Egypt and North Africa, and was somehow tied to its development, or in his particular view, its lack of development. And as my colleague at the California College of the Arts, Irene Cheng, pointed out, this concept was inspired by a highly racialist concept from the late 18th and early 19th century. De Cassis brought this kind of theory into a type of architectural origin story about light, darkness, construction, and so forth. So darkness as a spatial quality also becomes intimately tied to crime and vice in ways that continues to this day. I didn't look at this very closely, nor did my students, but again, these types of concepts are generally traced to 18th and 19th century shifts. So theories of health also greatly influenced the meaning and experience of darkness, daytime darkness. So Philippe Ram, who I mentioned earlier, is working on a fascinating new history of architecture, provocatively titled The History of Architecture. according to his history, there's someone named Saarinen. He makes this discovery that sunlight can kill tuberculosis bacteria. And this is from the 19th century. And this leads to calls to increase what we call the solarization, the intensity of sunlight of urban interior spaces so it hits our bodies. So what you're looking at here is actually something from his forthcoming book, and it's quite fascinating. This is an unusual tuberculosis sanatorium. I doubt any of you have seen this before, but this was sponsored, I believe, designed by Hermann Bremer in Gorbersdorf from 1862. And it was created before any of these ideas about sunlight and bacteria existed, before the idea that sunlight could kill microbial disease. So what's important about this building is that it's very dark inside. It doesn't have a string of south-facing rooms typical of sanatoria that would emerge later. This is a tuberculosis sanatorium. So this is what a tuberculosis sanatoria looks before one associates sunlight as a kind of cleansing agent. It's actually a quite dark and cavernous space. So by the late 19th century, the belief that sunlight can cleanse space becomes a lens through which almost all urban space becomes evaluated. And these are photos, and again, this is a metropolitan and a colonial kind of project. By the late 19th century, the belief that sunlight can cleanse space becomes extended into all kinds of urban reform efforts. So what you're looking at here are photographic documentations of the Lower East Side in which health reformers are documenting the very tiny air shafts or the small slivers of light that are available to people living in this very poor, somewhat working class neighborhoods. This is a documentation of the tenement conditions. And just one very quick aside for any of you who are interested in the history of photography. In documenting daytime darkness, this kind of quality, there was actually quite a number of innovations in the United States in flash photography, because it was almost impossible to photograph these spaces. So they involved innovations in the representation of architecture as well. So finally, I think, and what's the most powerful idea, is that darkness becomes associated with the past. And I think, again, this might be the most powerful idea. Darkness takes on a historical quality. And this is a diagram created by the architect Henri Sauvage. This is somebody I knew nothing about before doing the studio with my students at Yale. This particular diagram was discovered by a student of mine named Yui Gang. And here he's tracing a kind of history of architecture through the section of the street in which one begins with a kind of darkened medieval street on the left, then the kind of street of the boulevard of Osman from the mid-19th century, and then his architecture on the right, which is completely solarized. So Otrafa means like of the past, of another time, today, and the architecture of tomorrow. And of course, he is tomorrow. So he ended that with the diagram of his vision for the streetscape and the development of Paris. And this also has a somewhat racialized component as well. Sauvage combined ideas about solar health with his own interpretations of the French colonial experience in Northern Africa. And so this is one of the only large-scale buildings that Sauvage completed. You can see how it represents his ideas. It also has that kind of vitreous ceramic skin that you saw on the Reliance building earlier. It's incorporated. It's very much a statement about health. And it actually has a pool in the center of it. So a kind of urban building as a health-giving environment in myriad formal and material ways. Finally, this isn't just a story about high modernism, okay? The late modern historicisms or postmodernisms even draw some of their visual and aesthetic power, their rhetorical power, from transforming typologies and the ways that they're discussed within architectural theories. So for example, in both of these images, we see the kind of somber darkness associated with the archaeological project of studying Egyptian architecture transformed into sun-giving space. The Sackler Gallery on the left has an enclosure that very much mimics the Egyptian temple's form, but it's completely transparent and glazed. And I. M. Pei's pyramid for the Louvre works in a very similar way, kind of inverting the expectations of Egyptian funereal architecture. And just to my larger point about the intensity of solarization, on my last visit to this space in June, the people working inside had to use umbrellas because in the changing context of the climate in Paris, the mechanical systems cannot deal with the urban heat gain inside the pyramid. So it's quite striking to see people use umbrellas inside a modern building. Okay, so it's amazing to me in many ways, but not surprising, that contemporary architects still so passionately pursue this kind of war against daytime darkness, so aggressively in many ways, and with projects that powerfully solarize space with radiant aesthetics. So the work of Ralph Knowles, who was based at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, has been revived in recent years. Knowles' work, who you see on the left, argued for a strategy he called solar carving as a way to increase sun exposures, remove shadow, both interior and in public space. And much of this was about the potential energy gains we could have from sunlight. And his ideas have been revived recently by Charles Waldheim and Jeannie Gang architects. And this is on the right is a solar carving project she recently completed on the High Line, and in which her firm stated that the exterior has absolutely no shade and that everything is completely open to the sun. So before continuing, I just want to say that I obviously have some critical outlook or attitudes towards this, but I want to say I'm not like anti-sunlight, okay? This is, I just think we need to revisit some of the presumptions about the intensity with which certain environmental qualities are equated as being unquestionably good, particularly in a contemporary context with what many cities are dealing with. My ultimate argument is one for heterogeneity and a critical outlook on the historical past. So methodologically, our studio created a series of murals that explain much of the history I just mentioned to you, but in a highly graphic form. And there you can see the participants of the studio at the end. We sort of created a city out of these various visions of sunlight and urban and architectural and urban space. And again, via the urban production of nature idea, we wanted to demonstrate how the city produced sunlight through architectural form. I'm dealing with architecture, students that want to be architects, not necessarily historians. So we had to figure out a way to translate this history into something that has strong formal bias, a common language, let's say. So graphically, each of the kind of radiant or solarized architectural types, many of which I just mentioned to you, are contrasted to what the person who was helping me with the studio, Suri Schlabs, called their foils. what is it that each of these architects is trying to overturn historically or conceptually or formally in the built environment. So here, just to zoom in a bit, you can see Henri Sauvage's apartment concept next to the medieval streetscape that he was criticizing. On the bottom right, you can see I.M. Pei's pyramid contrasted to the masonry architecture of pyramids in the Louvre. One member of our studio who was analyzing the UN building brought up issues that I didn't consider at all when I was putting together the studio. The ways that sites are often cleared in their entirety to expose buildings to sunlight, which he saw as an intensely anti-historical attitude, that the sun always has a kind of contemporaneity versus a historical quality. So we eliminate the site's architecture in a kind of modernist tabula rasa, which you're all familiar with, but to create what we call a radiant aesthetics. And finally, I want to say, I realize that the examples we chose are not very global. I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. But we focused on examples that both influenced and resonated with similar and much less canonical buildings that we found in Vienna. And there's some things in the drawing that I didn't mention at all earlier, such as Hugh Ferris, an architect based in New York City, who developed a series of evolutionary and what we call accelerationist visions for skyscrapers based upon emerging ideas about zoning and sunlight in the city. You can just above Hugh Ferris, you can see Ralph Knowles' vision of solar carving, and again, myriad other architectural histories that you can probably recognize in the iconography of this particular drawing. Anyway, I found this it was a very nice way to bring studio into the beginning of a studio, in the beginning of a design process. And it resonates nicely with the work of colleagues such as Design Earth, working out of Cambridge and Ann Arbor, Michigan, and people like Lydia Calipolidi at Cooper Union, among others. So the lingering question is, how do we take all this information and gain or modernize darkness? And so we had to sort of just very quickly revisit some ways that people have looked at this in the past, and I'll just go through this very quickly. There's a very long strand of post-colonial critique in architectural and literary thought, actually. It's very critical of the kinds of solarization of, or the increasing illumination of space, just to put it in more plain language. The author, Junshiro Tanizaki, for example, wrote a book that was translated into English called In Praise of Shadows, and very early in 1933, as a kind of defense of Japanese aesthetics against the themes of illumination, transparency, and enlightenment. And what's often lost in his writings is that this was as much a critique of space as it was a kind of literary critique, very critical of the idea of radiance. The Egyptian architect Hassan Fatih was also concerned about the environmental qualities of continuously glazed spaces in North Africa. He views these as both environmentally and economically kind of nonsensical in this particular context. So these are all critical figures, but again, I wasn't quite sure how to use them in a study about Vienna, but they were certainly something that we or I was thinking of. And on the other hand, just very finally, you can also turn to similar critiques that emerge in the 1970s and 80s of kind of theories of architectural phenomenology that often have this bias towards darkness or cave-like interiors. This is something the architectural historian Ginger Nolan, also based in Los Angeles, has explored recently and critiqued this kind of primitivist turn in architectural phenomenology. So this is something that again was there, but I was trying to, I think we were all discouraged from bringing in these particular tropes to arrive at something else. So to get back to something I mentioned much earlier, I am very personally interested in the type of subtle environmental dispossession that the solarization of urban space represents. And what I mean by that is that when I lived in Vienna, they told people like myself, I have a very visible physical disability, I'm an amputee. They told people like myself who are disabled or who are elderly or have young children, when we were living in Vienna, they told us not to go outside during the daytime during one of these heat spells. And so I see recovering darkness in a way as a way to imagine a form of environmentalism that can also be tied to human impairment. And I mean that in two ways. One, darkness is associated with sickliness, but we can sort of appropriate it as a positive and twist it around in some ways to make us rethink that particular idea. So that's my own interest. But of course, when you're working with a group of students, they might not be interested in that at all. So there are myriad other ways to think about this. So just getting back to just one or two more examples. Some other ideas that we explored include a small handful of thinkers who see in darkness a type of untapped modernity. I think this is very interesting. So this includes the writing of people from over 120 years ago, like Alois Riegel, who's also Viennese. He wrote about something called Raumdunkel, spatialized darkness. And what he was simply describing was the way in non-representational aspects of art, we might see the use of the idea of darkness, but not as something that appears to originate from nature, but as something that's clearly created by an artist's hand. So it describes a kind of non-naturalistic darkness that appears in artworks. We also looked at the concept of artificial darkness by Noam Alcott, that's related to media theories of space. The violet deep idea of the ecological theorist Stacy Alemo, which deals with what's potentially known or unknowable because of darkness. And finally, we also thought about darkness, daytime darkness, in some very formal, basic formal architectural ways. We examined what happened when the ideas within various projects were simply run in reverse. So the second mural created by my students is called The City Reconstructs Darkness, or The City Regains Darkness. I can't quite remember what we called it. But here are the solar projects that I've mentioned to you. They become foils, and another architecture emerges in the mural, and that produces shade, interior darkened spaces, and any number of ideas of counter environments. Hugh Ferris gets turned upside down. Ralph Knowles' computations are run in reverse to produce increased interior and exterior shading. This was actually done by a student who was very interested how in certain ideas of Chinese architectural theory, Ralph Knowles' computations of space are incompatible. So how could we recompute them to align them with these other particular ideas about space and sunlight? The vanished contexts of the UN are piled on to create kinds of crevices and caves. The colonnades that were shown by Bruno Taut in his City Crown project become a type of public space that's all tied together. So what was surprising was how similar the city of Vienna was thinking about these things. So we made these murals, we go to Vienna, and we hear from planners in Vienna and tour a variety of sites. So I was actually floored, or pleasantly surprised, might be the better word, when one of the planners in Vienna mentioned that they are trying to bring back the medieval street section in future architectural developments in the city. So according to them, these narrow streets are very understudied. They perform better on hot days, and the air circulation is much better than their detractors in the 19th and 20th century described. So we also explored other spaces. One of that might interest you because it's so evocative is this vast underground network that was built during the Baroque era in Vienna. This is in the center of the city, a completely connected a 2 or 3 kilometer long area in the central district. This was built in the 17th and 18th century. Here we are 10 meters underground. I think it's 3 or 4 levels in some places. So my Viennese students, not my Yale students, I commissioned them to do a digital record of a small fragment of these underground areas, which by the way have never been directed, have never been fully charted because the city discourages it out of fear of terrorism or whatever. Here's another scan showing some of their spatial quality. This shows it relative to a building, and this shows that just that small fragment relative to the entire center of the city. This runs underneath the entire underground of the entire city. It's never been charted, and it's actually an untapped environmental resource because the spaces are always at a very cool temperature during the summer. So it's a kind of a fascinating space to continue study. So let me wrap up this lecture by showing you a few of their projects. This is by a student, Yui Gang, who based her project on Sauvage's works. So she sort of intensified the medieval profile of the historic European street to produce shade through a kind of layered architecture. This is by a student, Andrew Economist Miller. He was the person looking at the UN, and he brings back historical traces in ways that produce more kinds of cavernous-like interior spaces, also relying on ideas of the architectural uncanny. And then finally, this is a very interesting project, student Valerie Lee, who chose this enormous, very much exposed site that's used mostly for like play fields and physical fitness, but has a few restaurants and housing projects scattered across an enormous area of the city. And she proposed to stitch it together with these colonnades that again bring back this idea of a kind of public experience of daytime darkness. So you'll notice that in these 3 examples, there's a kind of lingering historicism in many of these projects, and that's partly based upon current aesthetic interests at Yale, of course, but it also suggests to me that the project of modernizing darkness, whatever that might mean, is far from thought through and could continue to be examined. So let me wrap this up by saying that I don't intend this lecture to be a type of rallying cry for darkness. I am not the president of the Bring Back Darkness Society. That's not the role I want to put myself in. That's not the ultimate point here. I want to go back to what I mentioned in the beginning, that this idea that I get from Neil Smith, that the nature we produce also produces, or in some senses reproduces, the subjectivities that we imagine in cities. And this is relevant to things here on our continent, the American construction of wilderness, which constructs an idea of an American innocence, the idea of pastoral beauty, or something as small as an architectural interior. And all of these articulate through landscape, urban design, or architecture, those environments which cultivate whose idea of physical and historical experience belongs. So darkness is simply one of many environmental effects, but one that in many cities makes for a more heterogeneous space for all of us. So thank you. Yeah.
David, thank you so much for a really amazing lecture. It was pretty fascinating to kind of see darkness back into the conversation as a kind of value. I wonder if, so we are open now to receive your questions. We're open to business. I have a couple of my own though. And so, and I don't know if they will come across as questions or as comments that you may want to kind of respond to, but I'm pretty fascinated by the way you, well, by several things. I'm thinking of back to, earlier in your talk, your conceptualization of these weaker natures. I think there is a connection with your later research on darkness, and let me try and say how and why. So in weaker natures, or even in the idea of sub-natures, what you do is you deal with, let's say, a non-official history of nature, right? The kind of minor natures that are often overlooked by history, but are quite present in a kind of everyday experience of the world. So I have a question that is, in a way, historiographical, because somewhere you say that one of the challenges of dealing with these things is that you don't have an archive to go to. You don't have, you cannot just go to a library and deal with, I don't know, manuscripts. Or maybe you will, but just to back up some other findings. And I wonder, how do you produce those other findings, if not in a conventional archive, basically?
Yeah.
That would be one question.
Great, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to respond now, or yeah?
Yeah, maybe. Then I'll go.
Okay, yeah. Well, yes, this is an issue. When I was, the book that you mentioned earlier, Manhattan Atmospheres, when I was writing this book, that was my dissertation, and I began that not too long after 9/11, so let's say in 2003 or 2004. And not only is there not like a department of New York City air, but and not only was I having to like really pull in what felt like a very unrigorous way from all kinds of places like New York real estate boards that would quantify the amount of air-conditioned space in New York City. It was the only way to find out, or archives in the Metropolitan Museum of Art that would be thread thin. I'd not only have to like pull together things, but just like that underground space that I mentioned, just the refusal to look at a topic like that with any kind of close examination was really a challenge, because the New York Real Estate Board, for example, didn't want me to know the particulars of air-conditioned space in New York because of fear. Studying places like the Ford Foundation or the Metropolitan Museum of Art was even worse. It was very closed in terms of even the possibility of looking at that. Well, they were perfectly happy if I wanted. So the way let me interrupt myself. The way I studied air, for example, in Metropolitan Museum of Art, because they wouldn't let me look at the drawings of the mechanical systems, was to look at the artifacts and the condition reports as a way to explore that. So it's very challenging. And the issue with Vienna, with the underground, was also fascinating. There were so many issues around studying that in any greater detail. So it's not just that these spaces, not just the historiographical things that someone like you and I would deal with if there's no archive, but the sense of the larger kind of social paranoia that surrounds the study of these things makes it quite prohibitive.
So that's an amazing thing, because in a way, so we tend to associate the uses and abuses of nature as basically forms we humans have to pursue order, right? So we use nature as a model. We use nature to imitate some of its so-called principles and so forth. But when it comes to these minor or weaker natures or sub-natures, what you're describing is a kind of subterranean system of order. It's an alternative system of order. So I don't know if this will make sense, but I've been thinking based on your work that it's not that these weaker natures or sub-natures don't entail a pursuit of order or of systems of order. It may be different than the ones we're used to when we invoke nature. We don't want to be, mimetic with regard to nature, maybe. But there is a use of nature which is, even in the picture you showed by Benevolo, I mean, it's a highly kind of designed frame of an otherwise kind of well-known building. So I'm just wondering if the notion of order, how nature or these weaker natures of sub-natures are used or instrumentalized to create systems of order that may not be otherwise the ones we're used to.
Yeah. That's something I haven't thought about much, but as you and I know well, the histories of hygienic reform, particularly through architecture in cities, they catalyze architectural thinking and municipal action and capital to remake enormous areas of urban space based upon a kind of a vision or a lens of urban disease that comes through these themes like darkness or dust or air pollution and so forth. So that's how I would think about that comes through. That's a fairly well-known process. Yeah. The question is, how do you modernize modernization? I guess is something that interests me. That comes up with the darkness theme. I lost the last bit of my thought, but it's a very interesting question.
Yeah. So. Well, it seems we have a very shy audience today. There we have. Yeah, just we have a question now, but just very quickly before that, I'll just come back to my thought anyway.
No, I can actually. Oh, let me bring up one last thing because it brings up something that connects both of our work. So when I was doing that, I was, as Cristóbal mentioned, I did this reconstruction in 2014 of this landscape that only existed for about 48 or 72 hours in the middle of France and was used in this kind of revolutionary spectacle to destroy a monument. And it relates to your idea about order. One of the things that interested me about that was that I was getting very frustrated with all these nature reconstruction projects that were happening in cities, including Paris. That were so sentimental and so ecologically driven versus politically driven. So I wanted to, not as a counter monument, not like, I forget the name of the author of that particular idea, but as a counter environment to propose a different way to understand the meaningfulness of the history of nature in a city that wasn't sentimental. And that was, well, my project was certainly romantic, but it wasn't sentimental about a kind of pastoral or natural past that could be recovered, but that the recovery of nature would be the recovery of politics in the city, one that was, as you know, extraordinarily disruptive and ferocious. Yeah.
That's great. So let's move to a couple of questions we have here. This is Sarosh. I'll just read, okay? I find there to be various correlationships between your ideas on darkness and, say, the notions of temporal phenomena. For example, weathering, as theorized by Mostafavi and Lederberg, and clouds by Sejima and Ishigami, which could also be described as subnatures. You speak of Tanisaki's Praise of Shadows, a text that has references to phenomenology, yet you are distant from making any overt references to phenomenology ideas of phenomenon.
Yeah.
There you go.
It's a great question. Should I go ahead and answer that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I got in a little bit of trouble 10 years ago because when I wrote Subnature, because I mentioned how it was a bit of a, in the introduction, how it was a bit of reaction to weathering. I mentioned the book by name. And, you know, you know, the people that have written that, one of them's, you know, become a colleague of mine, and I have great respect for their work. I found that the so-called impacts or effects or indices of environment or nature in the city, whatever term you want to use, was something that they were very interested in. But the larger notion of the constructed nature of the surrounding sphere of the building that produced those effects of pollution or weather was something that really went unexamined in the book. So it's really interesting you mentioned that book. So just reflecting a bit, when I wanted to write more seriously in a more academic way about the history of nature and architecture, I actually had to turn to work with geographers who seized on that very idea that there's no given, and that it's a constant process of production and construction when we're talking about nature, particularly in any urban context. So I would argue that phenomenology has that. The other, just very quickly, and this is a bit more political, as I've gotten further on with my work, I've become very critical of phenomenology, and this is from a more recent awakening I've had as a physically impaired architectural historian. There's an intense kind of athleticism in phenomenological aesthetics that goes completely unexamined. Actually, I think Ginger Nolan might be one of the few people who begins to take that on, but it's something that really bothers me. So I've always been very hesitant from a kind of subconscious way, and now I can articulate better as to why I distance myself from it. But it's a great question, and those three things you mentioned are people I definitely think about in developing my own ideas.
Great. So Sarosh compliments by saying, thank you for a terrific talk. And we have Ignacio Galan from New York. Dear David, thanks so much for such a thought-provoking lecture. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about the way in which you position Jacob Riis in your genealogy. And maybe clarify the politics of solarization in relation to the housing design reforms that he sponsored, Jacob Riis. I understand that you're not developing your argument against sunlight, and that there are many and contradictory projects in your powerful genealogy, but I wonder if you could clarify the politics at play in this particular instance, in Jacob Riis's housing reforms.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Nacho, thanks for asking me a question back, because I asked you a question during your lecture. That's a great question. So I actually worked on Riis long time ago, like in the late 90s. So I haven't really thought about him too directly. More recently, like, you know, my students in the studio were looking at him more carefully. Riis was, you know, Danish-American reformer who documented the Lower East Side and was involved with a variety of reconstruction projects in that area. I'm not sure I have a whole lot. I love your question. I'm not sure I can answer it so well. I would say that he was the person I was referencing who really revolutionized, for an American context, took European ideas about how to photograph darkened spaces. Are you asking like how his, I'm not sure, are you asking how his ideas ultimately informed transformation to the building code? Because that, you know, like the transformation to the dumbbell apartment, so to speak?
Let me see.
Or the kind of housing reform exhibitions that he was involved with that were shown in France, or? It's
in particular in relation with the housing design reforms that he sponsored. Yeah, more broadly, I think.
Yeah, I can't.
This is not again. I want to get at the politics of his projects.
Okay, yeah. I think this is more your area than mine. It's not. I'd have to revisit that closely. Yeah.
Well, then we have Akshita Sivakumar. Thank you, David. This was fascinating. The exciting promise of subnatures seemed to be an invitation to move beyond the formal Gestalt switches. Do you see the Gestalt flip of mass void as a result of architecture's own formal commitments in a studio setting?
I need some help with that question. Let me just go back to Nacho's very quickly. You know, Nacho, a long time ago, I wrote this article called The Opticality of Revanche, which was a very dramatic title about Jacob Riis and about how the camera was very much I mean, we wouldn't use the word gentrification back then, but how the camera was very much positioned to create a kind of revenge on these particular spaces. So that's the only way I can connect to your question. Okay, so sorry, so voids. What's this?
Let me see here. So, okay, so I'll go again with Akshita Sivakumar. Thank you, David. This was, yeah. The exciting promise of subnatures seemed to be an invitation to move beyond the formal Gestalt switches. Do you see the Gestalt leap of mask/void as a result of architecture's own formal commitments in a studio setting? I'm thinking of other ways you might be thinking of challenging why darkness has to be dragged into the modernizing project in a way that keeps the values of modernization intact. This may be connected to your trailing modernization comment, but I typed this out.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I haven't completely thought this through, but there's something about this topic, particularly in the studio context, that I think was very disruptive. Like a few students and a few jurors were just like, just trying to imagine restructuring a space to produce more interior darkness, not exterior shade. So it's just rubbed them the wrong way. I mean, went against what their kind of inherent beliefs about like certain qualities that should be inherent to space. So that was challenging. And I have to be honest, I haven't completely thought it through. The thing that's the lingering issue for the studio and that I mentioned earlier, and I probably shouldn't make an evaluative comment, but I will, is that the projects that were somehow the strongest in terms of their vision for darkness were also the ones that had to turn to some kind of historical or historicist strategy. By that I mean like it would reference a traditional form of architecture that we associated with darkness. It would seem to refer back to some kind of pre-modernized space, or in one case, a student dredged up the Jewish history of Daniel Whipcomb dredged up the Jewish history of Vienna in a way that also felt like a kind of a return or a moving back to something to reclaim this spatial quality and to bring it forward. Okay, so subterranean aesthetics, arches, medievalizations of space. So I think we don't. I would really love someone to prove me wrong. I don't think we have a kind of an avant-garde, or that's not the right word, an enlightened notion of darkness. I just think it's a paradox.
That's great. Another friend here, Enrique Ramirez. So just a comment. He writes, your ideas about minor environments remind me of the Viennese author Hermann Broch, who organizes his 1945 novel, The Death of Virgil, into chapters that correspond more or less into the elements, almost like in Subnature. That's Enrique's comment. Do you want to say something about that, or?
I'll have to check that out. Yeah, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah. Hannah Hortig, thank you for the excellent lecture, David. I have a question regarding the notion of shading. Christopher Hawthorne, the Chief Design Officer for LA, has brought up this idea similarly to you as something that affects certain populations disproportionately. In LA, the role the buildings play in terms of, shading is difficult. Structures are often shorter and streets are often much wider than in European cities or in New York. How do you see the role of both subnatures and the often banal street infrastructures / furnitures entering into the architectural history of addressing crisis?
So those are really, thank you for asking that question, because it brings up all kinds of things that I thought about before presenting this material to people who I assume are mostly in Los Angeles. Yeah, I mean, what Chris is doing with the city is really interesting to me, and I've actually been following it very closely. I think in Los Angeles, like Vienna actually, most of the strategies that are available to municipalities to combat what in our Yale studio we call the solarization of space is landscape architecture, landscape, so planting of trees, green spaces, so forth. I think one of the things for us that was the challenge was, learning from the kinds of things that Chris is doing in Los Angeles, or the kinds of things that are being staged in Vienna by landscape architects, you know, is there an architectural project that could complement this in some way, one that would extend from the streetscape into the interior buildings? So, so yeah, for sure. And the other issue that came up in the studio and in my own thinking, and also relates to Nacho's question, is that there's a kind of that street section that I showed of Henri Sauvage that represents a kind of totalizing strategy to remake space to certain kinds of environmental effects, whether it's the circulation of people, of water, the movement of sunlight or air. So that transition from the street to the interior is something that I feel like we have to be very critical of or aware of, because that's where what I'm describing as environmental heterogeneity, that's where it gets lost, is in that very type of representation. So that requires a lot of thinking and a lot of thought moving forward. I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but that is the site in which exactly what that person just asked, that's the site in which that has to be thought.
Yeah.
Or unthought.
That's right. So this is Ken Coense. I'm thinking about Gordon Matta Clark's Fake Estates project, where he documented quote unquote unconstructed leftover spaces, mechanical area, ways, and uninhabitable, unbuildable spaces, etc. Are you aware of this project and his other works that seem to have threats to these projects?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's interesting, you know, Gordon Matta Clark has such a role to play in terms of these precedents, and I don't know, you know, it wasn't something that I encouraged anybody to look at closely, or I've looked at myself. I will say, one of my mentors, somebody named Tobin Siebers, who sort of encouraged me through my own writing to be a bit more liberal, or to use a contemporary term, sort of out about my struggles with physical impairment, wrote a really, right before he died, he wrote a really interesting series of essays and gave a very interesting series of lectures about fake estates, when he said it was really a comment about urban inaccessibility in an era of kind of ideas of urban functionalism and movement through space, circulation. So I thought that was a really interesting recovery of Matta Clark that makes the connection between an environmental idea and an idea about mobility and impairment in the city, this kind of inaccessible space that becomes a kind of art project, right? Yeah.
How are we doing? We have more questions, so are doing fine?
I'm good. You know, it's yeah, I'm fine. I'm good. Yeah,
that's perfect.
I'm enjoying this very much, by the way. Thank you.
Okay, great. So this is Tay Carpenter. David, thank you for a really fantastic talk. I was wondering if or how your reading of darkness has engaged with places like Greenland, for example, where darkness is an embedded cultural and aesthetic value. Recent urban design studies have tended towards a maintenance of a spectrum of darkness rather than an introduction of intense solarization.
Yeah, you know, I'm not familiar with that context so much, right? Where there's like essentially a winter that is, well, from our perspective, maybe brutally dark, certainly from a Los Angeles perspective, and a summer that's completely bright. I haven't thought about that, but too much. But it was actually when I was visiting Stockholm during the summer, when I began thinking about a lot of these ideas and experiencing a daytime that, you know, in which I was exposed to the sun whenever I went outside at any time of the day. I'm not familiar with the ideas of preserving darkness. I don't know if she can type in a comment, but maybe that's an idea about nighttime and like viewing. Is it about viewing the sky at night? I'm not so familiar with that. I don't feel like I'm doing a very good job of answering this question, but it's really interesting. I will say I published this synopsis, so to speak, of the talk that I just gave in Art in America, just this past couple of weeks, and a few people from Stockholm were like, I completely disagree with these arguments. The idea of anybody increasing or intensifying darkness, especially during the daytime, was just considered so cruel to these people, right? But again, it's about perspective. I mean, you know, in fact, earlier today, I was on in a reviews meetings with Charles Waldheim, for example, who works on this project, and you know, somebody I very much have a dialogue with, and I think this this work is very much inspired by people like himself that work globally and are looking at ways to increase sunlight, which again, it's no question we think of as like an urban amenity or value. But this brings in obviously a different perspective.
Yeah. So for now we have the last one. This is Garrett Ricciardi. David, thank you for an excellent talk. Related to language, if we think of other material aspects of architecture that have taken on vocabulary that publics may initially struggle with, let's say the rebranding of waste or as recycle, etc. Part of the issue seems to be redeveloping/inventing new languages around these ideas as a path towards adopting them. In your mind, are there new vocabularies, words, phrases, turns of phrases, etc., that can help reframe the word darkness so that it doesn't elicit some of the negativity that may publics instantly attach it to? I'm thinking about the way painting has produced ideas like Chiaroscuro, for instance.
Yeah, it's an easier question for me to answer. I apologize to Tay for sort of not being able to engage the question fully. It's a very interesting question, just not something I can speak to so much. Yes, I mean, Garrett, that is exactly the issue. It's and especially for someone like myself who writes about this, like how do you introduce a term? And Chiaroscuro is something I think that one of the students brought up as something to be interested in. And because we were working in this Viennese context, I mentioned it very quickly, but the idea of Alois Riegel's of Raumdunkel, spatialized or spatial darkness, is really the idea of Chiaroscuro, except unlike Chiaroscuro, he's talking about things like, he was talking about paintings by Rembrandt, for example, and you would see the edges begin to enclose and be dark, even though there was sunlight coming into space. And he's arguing that this is a darkness that's made as an artificial effect as like a compositional tool that was complete artifice. So that term interested me, but of course that term also has the word darkness in it. So yes, I think the issue of language is absolutely critical, and a term like Chiaroscuro could be good. There's, I think like many people, we're trying to bring in more global histories. There's probably a term that derives not from a European language that might do a better job of explaining some of these ideas, because the value system that has produced some of the architectural effects that we're critical of obviously comes out of Romance languages and English, and German. So yeah, language is central, and something that I continue to think about for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the example from waste to recycling to dark to Chiaroscuro is great. Yeah, it's really good.
We have another question, which is by Irene Brison. Thank you for a great talk. You refer to the moral or othering relationship of darkness with colonized places and people. But I wonder if you could speak more to the implications for this work in such formerly colonized, quote unquote, tropical locations, or in much of the global south where modernization of urban space immediately encountered the extreme heat of increased solarization.
Yeah, I love that question, just because it provokes me, because it's exactly where this project has to go. Because I love that question because I don't have the answer to that question right now, but I want to have the answer to that question because, it's critical. Like, the entire French colonial project in Algeria, which has been, has some really good architectural histories, including some very recent architectural histories. That's where I think you can find some discussion of this environmental theme, particularly people like Henri Sauvage, who sort of was aware of what was happening there and likely informed some of the urban strategies that were proposed and in some cases built there. And also because it's a site that has so much photographic documentation that is disturbing to us today in terms of its aesthetic effects. So I think that's a good place to look. In a tropical context, I'm not as aware. I was in the Dominican Republic recently, where I was talking about these ideas with some architects there, and yeah, I think that they are aware that there needs to be an aesthetic shift in terms of some practices and some thinking about some architectural practices in that country in particular. You know, it has a very vibrant architecture scene. So, yeah. But yeah, very important question. Yeah.
Well, and you refer to to Savage as a as a kind of mobilizing, a kind of totalizing project with this building that basically, yeah, it involved a very unified view of what solarization had to be and the way it had to look when it transferred into an architectural project. If I'm reading your idea well. It seems to me that in much of your research, throughout all of these years, and ending in the studio, the idea of infrastructure that might be attached to the project of producing darkness is always more contingent, less permanent, less solidified in a kind of 100-year project or something like that. Because it already kind of anticipates that the idea of darkness will probably be overturned in 75 years more, just as solarization was in a way. So, in other words, I don't know if you've thought about this and if there is such a thing as an aesthetics of darkening that could be mobilized through this, what I largely take to be an infrastructural project. What would it look like? Would it be kind of temporal just as much as, thinking of this in terms of, its counterpart, which would be the very solid Sauvage building, which is a building incredibly beautiful and kind of compelling, but from another kind of mindset, of course, another epoch. So.
Yeah, do you want me to respond, or should we wrap up?
Yeah, it's more like a comment, but if you have thoughts on that, like what would a project of darkening basically would look like if it doesn't come by way of buildings that are there to stay for a very long.
What would the infrastructure of this be, so to speak? Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, the reason, for example, Manhattan has its particular qualities of daylight, so to speak, in like June, July, August, and September is because of building codes, right? That negotiate the street section in a very specific kind of way. So I imagine like it would, and I imagine there is I'm not a futurist, so I don't want to predict, but one could imagine that there is, the possibility of rethinking the building code so that something like shade, getting back to Christopher Hawthorne's work, is seen as more of like a public amenity versus something that's like happens incidentally, as a negative, as an externality, as a negative outcome. But so I would imagine that the quote unquote infrastructure would emerge through the process of codes. The other thing that you bring up that really relates to the one, or I'm working on two, book length projects right now, is like, how can the idea of infirmity be used to rethink some qualities of urban space without sort of resorting to a very facile idea of disability rights and accessibility, which doesn't interest me at all. So like, how can ideas about, which is this Darkness project is very much about, how can ideas about infirmity be rethought relative to contemporary politics, ideas of environment, post-colonialism, et cetera, and be a systemic way of rethinking things, again, from the street to the interior, and in ways that subjects like light and dark begin to come up among many, many others, aesthetics of nature and public spaces, monuments,
That's great. I think David is a good point to kind of wrap up. This has been a real pleasure, and I thank you. On behalf of. Oh, there's another question. Yeah, so maybe we take this last one and then we sort of wrap up.
I just want to also thank you for your generosity and all the questions, which are very generous. I really appreciate it. So.
Well, it's been our pleasure. So this is very, very brief anyway. Janine Henry, comment on vocabulary ideas. I like the term umbra. Verb umbra.
Perfect, right, yeah, perfect.
There you have. So that's actually a really nice, point to close this session. David, again, thank you so much. I hope that next time it is in person that we meet. We have you at the school. Best of luck for what comes next.
Yeah, thank you. And I hope you all have a safe and healthy conclusion to your semester. And thank you again for hosting me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. See
Okay.
you
All right.
next
Bye.
time. Bye.